Auxier tackles the problem of pastoral care, Christian community, and recovery.
Thank you. Can we have a big hand for Carol Ann?
And it is a big hand. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's been great working with you. She's done so much to make everything go so smoothly and coordinate all these activities and make sure that this is a first-rate operation for ADC. And I just will say, I hope to say it at the end of my time tonight, how much I have appreciated being here and how thankful I am for the opportunity to be part of your church fellowship here at ADC and in the Atlantic Baptist Conference. A comment that was given to me by one of you was that I should be sure to address the helpfulness of ministries and activities such as Al-Anon. Al-Anon, of course, is the branch of AA that's designed to help family members of a loved one who has a problem with alcohol. And I think that that's a very good suggestion, and we've touched on it, but I just want to make a special note of that as we launch into tonight to make sure I don't lose track of it. Al-Anon was founded by folks who were sending their loved ones to AA, but realizing they themselves needed some help because it was difficult to live with somebody who was troubled by problem drinking. And so they banded together and formed a 12-step fellowship of their own to help them figure out new ways to constructively and positively cope with the stresses that exist in an addicted family system. And so I really do recommend to you as pastors that's a great resource. One of the key principles in Al-Anon is to teach family members how to love their loved one, but at the same time learn to detach from some of their behavior and to also not keep supporting them by enabling them, but allow their loved one to face consequences for their behavior so that they might have an opportunity to have a reality-based world to live in rather than one where they're always constantly protected and loved to death by a family member who might be trying to rescue them when they really need to let them face some realities that their addiction is bringing upon them. So I do want to remind you of that. And there's literature out in the narthex, or pardon me, the lobby for those of you who have not heard of Al-Anon or need some other resources. So we're off tonight. Dr. McDonald has informed me that he has a large hook. He's going to be hooking me off the stage at 9:45, so I'm going to try, 9:45, yes. I'm not going to do that to you, Lee, but I'm going to try to be good. You know, how many of you try to be good? Yeah, well, you know what? I'm not going to do more than try tonight. I'm going to be good. All right? I'm going to be good. So I'm authorizing the entire crowd to leave at 8:45 if necessary. So I make sure that I'm good. And if not, you come and take me off the stage bodily. It's okay with me. Let's quick look at a couple of things from last night that we didn't touch on. So I want to just quick review some things. So if you take last night's handout, I just want to cover a few points here to begin with that we didn't talk about before. On the front page of last night's handout, and I think they were available at the table coming in, and then hopefully you have it here. There was a section that says the 5 relationships, addictions as biopsychosocial spiritual problems. I'm just going to quickly touch on this. I have to confess, this is not a terribly sophisticated theological understanding of the problems of mental health or addictions. It's just a conceptualization that I use when I'm thinking about pastoral counseling as part of pastoral care and trying to ground it in some kind of theological understanding. But it's not a terribly sophisticated look at it. But it's a way to kind of break down the problem that we have is you have, on one hand, the biblical teachings about human nature that are very critical, I think, informative and definitive. On the other hand, sometimes we have behavioral science and those kinds of things which have a totally different view of human nature. And I'm trying to figure out how not to become compartmentalized and kind of Gnosticized, where we have this division here between science over here and religion over here. Because if we really believe what the Bible says, God's the author of creation, and therefore if we study the created order, we can learn something about our Creator. So science and faith don't necessarily have to be in completely different compartments. They're part of the bigger picture of who God is and how He's created us. And so having said that, I kind of think when I teach students at ACT seminaries where I work or work with pastors, I kind of think about people having 5 basic relationships that the Bible has set forth that are crucial to them. The first one is a relationship with God. And as we talked several times already about how we are designed for attachment to God our Father, that there's an intimate connection that we have been made for as His children. And we've been designed in His image and occupy this unique place in the created order, that we're special to Him, and He wants to bond and link with us. And that's vital. And so that's that first relationship we're really called to be with and be into. The second relationship we're called into, I think, as image bearers of God, is we actually have a relationship with ourselves. And this is it's self-evident that we are to be related to God because it's taught all through Scriptures. The idea that we have a self is self-evident in the sense that if you read the Psalms, you see the psalmist or David or whoever it is speaking in a particular psalm, often self-reflecting, talking about himself. All of us think about ourselves all the time. We have inner conversations. Did anybody ever talk to themselves anywhere here? Okay. You might be saying right now, I don't know what he means. And then the other part of you is saying, I don't know what he means either. As you're talking back and forth with yourself. But we have a self that we refer to somehow. And it's that selfness that makes us unique. That's what makes you a person. You're able to self-reflect. It's probably what makes us different from any other part of creation in terms of the animal kingdom. We have this self-reflective ability that's unique. So we're designed to have some kind of relationship with ourselves, an inner relationship, as well as a relationship with God the Father. And then the third area of relationship that's intrinsic to human beings, I think, is we are designed for relationship with other people. And primary in that, in my opinion, would be a relationship with our mate. And that's really important. But in addition to that, it covers all sorts of relationships, relationships to children, or relationships to our own parents, or relationships to our coworkers, or our colleagues, or our friends, or the people we're in ministry with, or to. All of those things. And so we are fundamentally relational people. And that's why if we over-individualize any kind of anthropology, or even some kind of psychology, we're making a mistake. Because we're going to miss the inherent connectivity that God has built into human beings. It's very much part of who we are. And that's the third kind of relationship that I think that is involved in being a human. The fourth one is we have a relationship of sorts with the angelic order, or the angels. And we don't think about this too often, but this includes both the angels who are following God and His obedient servants and messengers, as well as those who have fallen away from God and turned from Him, the demonic order. And so there's also a sense in which we may be possibly affected by that relationship at times. And then lastly, in the area of creation, I'm using that as a ballpark description of we have a relationship in some sense with our physical surroundings, our bodies. Now, it's not the relationship in terms of an interpersonal relationship like the others that we're talking about. But it is some kind of relationship. I'm not a disembodied spirit floating around, right? That part of the genius of the Hebraic notion of human beings is that we're embodied souls, and that our bodies are intrinsically tied into somehow our spiritual nature as well. And so that we also exist in this physical world. Now, when you think about people having problems as an issue in pastoral care, then one of the things you can do is think of in terms of these 5 relationships. If someone's coming to me with a problem, I might want to ask myself, is the primary difficulty this person's facing a problem in their relationship with God? It could be. They may be angry at God because someone died who they really loved, and that may be the big issue. Or it may not be. They may be fine, more or less, with their relationship with God. That may not be the crucial point there. Their problem may be argument over the inheritance relating to that person's demise, and that they're having strife and struggle with a sibling who's trying to steal the family inheritance. In that case, the problem is not centered so much on their relationship with the Lord, although there may be impact there, but it's often between them and another person. And that's where the disorder is that I need to address pastorally. It could be that somehow in the legacy of this person's life and the person who died might have abused them. And maybe then part of the issue was through that and other events, Satan has come in and kind of used that abuse against them and created a bunch of lies that they have believed about themselves or God or something else. And so maybe there's some demonic involvement. That could be a factor. At the same time, maybe what's going on is a person died, and normally, if you're going through a grieving process, you're going to grieve normally, but actually, after about 3 months, you're probably going to feel a little better, even though you'll still miss the person. That's normal grief kind of range. But maybe it's 9, 10 months later, and you're still just devastated. And now what's happening is a chemical imbalance has begun to develop in your brain, where you haven't had as much serotonin available, and so you're getting into a long-term depression, not just grieving. And in that case, your body's become disordered. So when we think about people, I try to think about this because I think you could draw a circle around this whole thing. All of this is about God, okay? Because God's the one who made our bodies and designed us to operate in a certain way. So when our bodies aren't functioning correctly, that's not an unspiritual, strictly biological problem. It reflects the truth that everything that exists is from God's hand, and it's part of His plan. And so nothing happens that's not spiritual in that sense, because these 5 relationships were set up by Him, if you would. So I try to use this way of thinking a little bit about when trying to help people, sorting out where the main problem lies for them. And lots of times these are interrelated. Sometimes it's not just simply one or the other. So you could draw all sorts of lines and connections here. But it's a simple way to try to get you to sort out a little bit what's the main thing going on for this person. And recognize that people may have several things going on at once that should be addressed. And that's certainly true as well when we come to the problem of addictions, because we could use that as an example. An addicted person may feel God has abandoned them because they've prayed over and over again, Lord, take this away. I don't want to crave drugs. I don't want to be this way. Help me. And then they felt like God didn't answer them. And so they feel like God's abandoned me. He's not there for me. I don't care. He doesn't care about me. And so that person who's coming to your office as a pastor may have issues with God, feeling like God let him down. They also may have issues in themselves, too, where they feel that they are worthless because of what they've done or what's been done to them. And they may have deep feelings of total rejection of themselves. And they think they're unworthy and unlovable. And so there may be problems with their view of themselves. Their drinking or their drugging may have created chaos in their family or people who are depending on them. And they may have lots of alienated, broken relationships. And so they may have a problem in that area in their life. And it's possible that through all the darkness that's gathered around them as they've been involved in an addiction, that maybe there's been some demonic influence as part of the picture too. Maybe that's capitalized on that chaos somehow. That could be a factor in some people. And then lastly, physically they may be suffering the effects that happen to you as you have become addicted to drugs and your body's adapted and built tolerance, and you're experiencing symptoms of physical withdrawal when you don't have the drug, or other types of long-range damage due to your drug or alcohol abuse. And so that's just an example of how this picture helps you organize thinking a little bit about it, and how it breaks down the notion of trying to say it's either scientific or biological or it's spiritual, when actually it's all spiritual, and it relates to these 5 relationships. And I hope that you can think about it, use it for what it's worth. If it's helpful, fine. If you think it's terrible, don't tell anybody, just don't ever use it. The next thing we want to catch up on, I don't know if I told you about this before I go in this. I should probably say this. I don't know if you're aware, in Las Vegas, a lot of the casino employees also are faithful members of churches. Some of the churches they attend are Roman Catholic churches. And apparently when folks are attending Mass and they're donating money, some of them are throwing in chips from the casinos in the offering plate. And now I guess they're getting so many that they have employed a monastery there, a Franciscan monastery, to sort out the masses of chips from the various casinos so they can turn them in. It's done by the chip monks. Now, on page, it says page 10 on your handout, the second handout, on the other side of the page that you were just on, just behind the circles. We're going to talk about spirituality, internal moves, and recovery. And I think this is to give you, what we're going to do tonight is really pretty simple. We've covered one piece. We've got 2 more pieces. This is a second piece. It's a little bigger. this will give you my ideas from a Christian standpoint of some of the internal world of a person who's struggling with an addiction. So you may have other ideas, and some of you have different experiences and so on. But these are, I think, fairly common types of dynamics. And not everybody will have all of these. But I'm trying to help you understand maybe what's going on in the heart and the soul of a person internally. And I'm also trying to get a look at what are some of the basic things to think about if you're helping a person try to move away from an addiction that you need to change, both internally and externally. So first we'll start out with the spirituality, internal moves in recovery. And I've got two columns here on the paper. You move from irrational beliefs on one side and lives serving the addiction. We'll put that over here. And then you on the other side, we have rational beliefs, spiritual truth that serves God. You're going to either have this master or the other master. You're going to either be attached here to the addiction that's sapping your life and trying to seek life from that which is actually taking it from you, or you're going to be able to be connected to the author of life and receive life and renewal and encouragement that your Heavenly Father wants to give you. And that's the dynamic, the pull that's there in an addiction. So, first of all, a person struggling with an addiction usually has an addictive voice going on in their head. Now, most people who have struggled with drugs or alcohol or gambling or pornography, overeating, other types of compulsive problems, when you start saying, is there an addictive voice, almost all of them will go, yep, I can hear that. Okay, I can hear that. It talks to me. You know, just one more drink. Or now I've got the problem licked. Haven't had a drink in 6 months. You know, I can go back to the way I used to drink. Nobody should tell you what to do. You should go drink. All that kind of stuff will be coming up for a person. And so you want to realize that people have this going. You can talk about it and say, is there kind of a voice in your head? Now, we say as Christians, I believe in the spiritual realities the New Testament describes, which includes, as we said, the angelic orders, including demons and so on. The addictive voice, in my opinion, is not a demonic presence. It's that part of the person that wants to use. Okay? But it's helpful and useful to begin to picture it as being alien to the person. It's not the real them. It's their addiction talking. And so this is just a handy way to start thinking and separating out the person from their problem. It can be difficult for someone to overcome something if I believe that I myself am actually intrinsically the problem. I saw this many times with folks when I was working in a treatment facility, that they didn't want to give up their addiction because they had concluded that they were their addiction. So recognizing there's an addictive voice here helps a person separate themselves out, that beloved imago Dei formed person, from this parasite, if you want to think about it that metaphorically, of addiction. So there's an addictive voice going on. An addictive voice is easily to define. Anything that I tell myself that supports using is the addictive voice. It could be all sorts of things. It could be your resentments. It could be your hopelessness. It could be things that straight out say what you're planning to do with drinking. Anything that supports your using is identified as your enemy. It's the addictive voice. And what you're trying to do is, on the other side, on the other column, is to begin to confront that addictive voice. When you hear it, you have a choice. If you let it keep talking to you and you don't stand up to it, it'll start running you. You can't just let it keep talking. You need to stand up to it and say, you know what? You're my addiction. You're talking to me right now, and I'm not listening to you. Okay? That's not true. Call it on what it's saying. Tell it the truth. I see the addictive voice says, for example, in somebody's head, your boss, he doesn't, what a jerk. He's mistreated you again. He's been unfair. He's not giving you the recognition you deserved. You worked so hard you didn't get that. Well, that's part of your addiction talking to you, because the next part is going to say, screw him. Why don't you go off and drink? Right? That's how it works. So when you hear that going on and on about the resentment towards your boss, if you're recovering from an addiction, one of the things that would be good for you to do, if you could learn to do it, is to step back for a second and say, wait a second, that's my addiction talking. I'm not listening to that. My boss isn't the greatest boss in the world, but I like this job because it's given me a paycheck, and I appreciate that because I can take care of my family. So you're right, I don't always like my boss, but no boss is perfect, and I'm not listening to you. That's an example of the kind of help the kind of thing that you want to have starting to change in a person's life. Identifying addictive voice, beginning to confront it, and not just go with it. All right? Because that's called starting to live consciously instead of living automatically. When you're in the throes of an addiction, through associative learning and that neural highway, you live your life automatically. You don't think anymore. This is about awakening the power that you have to make choices by becoming a conscious person and not just the slave of the addiction. The second one, addiction is my exclusive attachment. I'm in love with my addiction. That is what we've been talking about as a metaphor for addiction, the romance of it. I love my addiction. It's there for me all the time. In fact, when you find a person and you work with them as a pastor or a counselor or a sponsor, sometimes people have deep love affairs. And, I will often say to them as we're working towards maybe standing up to their addiction and confronting their addiction and taking their addiction on, I will say, tell me about what your addiction's meant for you. And you know what? One of the things they'll say quite often is they'll say something literally like this. You know what? Alcohol was always there for me. It's as if it was their best friend. They say, alcohol was always there for me. Whenever I had a problem, something, I couldn't get my parents on the phone, or I couldn't talk to my wife, or I couldn't talk to somebody else. Nobody had time for me. But if I just poured myself a drink, it was right there for me. That's what it's like many times for a person with an addiction. And so what you're asking them to give up is a very meaningful relationship, if you would, that's been there for them. And because breaking up is hard to do, it's okay to grieve over the loss of that relationship. Because in that sense, it was doing something for them. It was meeting those attachment needs. Now, it was also trying to kill them. But it was still meeting those needs along the way. And so one of the shifts is to move from I'm in love with my addiction, and it means so much to me, and I don't know what I'd do without you. And the way we talk about romances, again, comes in here. It's that feeling like I can't live without you. That's a depth feeling, not just a saying. To trying to move on the other side, to breaking up with the addiction. To beginning to say, you know what, there were good parts to that relationship, but you're actually trying to kill me. It's like being involved with somebody who's real attractive to you, but crazy and wants to do you in. And beginning to set up the same kind of dynamic of saying, I can't keep going out with you. You're killing me. I'm stopping it. And so working on the idea of helping them break up with the addiction. And discover in replacement for it, though, you can't just break up. You need to go towards something if possible, don't you? Because recovery is not only about running away from the addiction. It's also about what you're running towards. And you've got to help people run towards something. Again, that's one of the things that's a great thing about the 12 steps. Because it's about running towards God. But that's a great thing about any kind of recovery. You've got to run towards your mate if you have one. Or towards recovering some things that are worthwhile and give you a sense of esteem. You've got to figure out not only what you're not going to do anymore, but what's good that you're going to do. And so discover God's attachment plan is beautiful and sufficient, and develop intimacy with God and also intimacy with yourself, because people who struggle with addictions are alienated from themselves, and also then restoring relationships with their mate. And you as pastors have the privilege, for some folks, maybe to help them in all three of those areas. A third area is this concept I've said before, is that a person has concluded, I am my addiction. I will just comment further that if I believe I'm my addiction, and I talk about giving it up, then their conclusion is, how do I give this up? How do I say this? It's almost like if you pictured a person with their addiction, and if they really have identified with it so tightly that they are their addiction, that if I remove that addiction from inside me, I would be hollow. There'd be nothing there. Because that's how identified I've become with my addiction. And they literally, I think, don't believe there's anything else to them. For some folks. Not true for everybody, but for some folks. And so what you want to do is begin to help that person realize, as I've already mentioned, that their addiction is not them. It is actually, and using a psychological term, ego alien. It's the enemy. Because if they are so identified with it tightly, I say, fight your addiction. It's like fighting themselves. But if they can step back and say, my addiction is a beast, or my addiction is a parasite that's come onto my life, I've let it grow in my life, then they can stand against it and say, I'm not going to cooperate anymore. So kind of illustrated earlier. So it's important, I think, for a person to make that shift so they can fight. Again, if you're going to use a disease model, you say, I'm fighting my disease. So there's a piece there that fits in the 12-step philosophy as well. But however you approach it, whatever metaphor or approach you use, it's really important for the person to be able to separate themselves out from the addiction itself. And so that is critical. I have had sometimes, I use empty chair work with people when I'm working professionally, and I'll say, put your addiction in the chair. I could think of a client I've got right now who's a cocaine addict and a Christian. I said, put your addiction in the chair. What does it look like? It's a big pile of cocaine, about 4 feet high, sitting in the chair. I say, and as this guy put his addiction in the chair, he started shaking in the presence of his addiction, if you would, quaking. I said, "What's going on?" He says, "I just seeing it makes me scared. It's so powerful." And as we talked about it, I began to have him just address his addiction in the chair and talk to his addiction and stand up against his addiction. And he ended up getting up and kicking over the chair. He took a powerful stand against his addiction that night. His physical symptoms, as he was thinking about cocaine, went way down for the night. Now, the story wasn't all over for him, but that was a real important moment. He began to distinguish himself from his problem and take it on as an enemy. I can think of another guy who was a wonderful technician for a computer company down in the southwestern United States. I had when I was working down there. And this guy had been a heavy drinker for 18 years in IBM. And they said, you either get to treatment or we're going to end your job. You're going to lose your retirement. He quit his job with IBM to protect his drinking. 2 years later, the new company he was at, he was a sought-after technician because he was a brilliant guy, great guy. He was drinking heavily again, of course. Hadn't done anything about his problem. And he came into treatment with this company because he said, I can't lose this job. He's an ex-Marine. He's sitting in a circle with the men that we're doing group therapy with. And we take his addiction and put it in the chair. It was a bottle about 6 feet high. This ex-Marine sat in the chair, absolutely overcome with fear. He was shaking. He started weeping and crying. He said, I can't face it. It's too powerful. He went to be about, you would have thought he was about 6 years old. He just went down into that kind of state, which I don't particularly recommend as a good thing at all. But his response to his addiction was powerfully symbolic of the reason why this guy couldn't get any recovery. This thing was huge, and he was about this big. And he felt utterly powerless. And we stood around him, and I couldn't get him to take a stand against his addiction. He was absolutely overwhelmed and terrified. And so the group got up, and we stood around him, and we put our hands on his shoulders, and I said to him, I want you to say this to your addiction. He said, you're too big for me, but with God's help, I can stand up against you. And I'm going to ask God to help me. And when he began to take on that statement, he suddenly was able to stand up against his addiction for the first time in his life. And he said, and those of us are here to support you. Others who care about you, they're standing with you, and they want you, they'll help you too. He repeated the same thing. He began to dialogue with his addiction and confront it. And he finally was able to stand up and stick out his finger and say, I'm on to you now, and with God's help, I'm going to be different. I'm going to be in recovery and not in slavery. Well, that's not the end of the story. That was a decisive moment. That was an important moment. It's not the end of the story. But it was a very important time. Because for the first time, he began to ask God to help him. For the first time, he began to see that his way of having to deal with his addiction is going to mean he's got to trust in God. So that's a very important thing. To break up with the addiction and also to confront the addiction as not you. Shame-based identity is very common in people who have struggled with addiction. Many times that was one of the things that attracted them to drugs and alcohol in the first place. They grew up in a family system maybe where they got messages, whether they're intended or not, whatever the intent was, they got messages somewhere along the line that they weren't important, or maybe they were worthless, or maybe they were told they were stupid, or you'll never amount to anything, or maybe they were treated like an object and abused, all those kinds of things. But the impact on a person when they go through those things is a deep belief that they are flawed and worthless. And if anybody really knew who I really was, they would never want anything to do with me. And so they have a shame-based personality that is controls them. And in order, when you feel ashamed, how does it feel? You enjoy that? It's an ugly feeling, isn't it? It's a horrible feeling. Personally, when I get shamed by somebody, the first thing I do is get angry. Because if somebody shames me, I'm a lot better at being angry than I am being ashamed. I'd rather be angry any day than be ashamed. So if I feel shamed or I shame myself about something, next thing I'll know, I'll try to find somebody to blame for something so I can be good and angry because that covers up my shame. Well, other things cover that up too for people, and sometimes it's drugs or sometimes it's pornography. This is very important in pornography addiction. Most men who get involved in pornography have developed, either before or during the process of becoming addicted, a very deeply shamed personal identity. And then the way the pornography cycle works is they get triggered, their shame starts setting in, they start viewing pornography and fantasizing, they start masturbating then, they masturbate, then there's a momentary relief, and then how do they feel? Out of control and even deeper shame. And then they're training themselves, so anytime I feel a lot of shame, what do? More porn, more masturbation, acting out, release, and then deeper shame. And that's why it continues to keep them enslaved to the process, that shame-based personality. I had a good friend. He came to me after I was preaching on 1 Corinthians 7 about marriage. He said, John, I've got to tell you, I've got a terrible problem. He began to describe a lifestyle of all sorts of sexual addiction, pornography, so on. He hadn't been unfaithful to his wife, but it's pretty deep stuff. Been spending hundreds of dollars on pornographic materials. Couldn't buy a house probably early on because he was putting so much money secretly into high-priced pornography and phone sex that there wasn't enough money to save up. And as we talked and we walked through things, I'll just call him Roger. Roger and I talked through his problems, and he began to get help and turn to the Lord. One of the things that we identified was he was Special Roger. See, Special Roger was how he looked at himself. And that meant that if he was 4 minutes late for work, and he was a very punctual guy, unlike myself, but if he was 4 minutes late for work, he would berate himself his entire run. Now, anybody else in the yard who was late, he didn't hold it against him. And he was usually 10, 15 minutes early because he was very punctual. But everything had to be perfect that he did, or else he was trash. And that's coming out of a source of shame about himself. He had no grace to give himself. He had no love to give himself. And you could trace it back into how he was raised and some family dynamics and so on. So he really had, we started laughing about him being Special Roger after a while. Oh, okay, there's Special Roger, You got to be perfect. Accept yourself as a person who God loves even though you're not. And that's a movement from this shame-based mentality to a grace-based mentality. So vital for good recovery. So embracing God's grace then. And this is a line that I encourage you to think about. I'm a valuable, fallible, beloved child of God. Actually, all of those phrases are quite important, I think, in pastoral care. Because if you're dealing with people who have been imprisoned by shame, and they hate their self, if you say, well, if you say just an affirmation, I'm just a child of God, and you say that, you should embrace that. Frankly, it doesn't work very well. And the reason is because the rest of the sentence in their head goes, okay, I'm a child of God, and I'm loved by God, and the rest of the sentence goes, as long as I perform. Okay? That's how it works. So, that's right, Pastor. I know God loves me as long as I am perfect. That's the rest of the sentence. As long as I perform, as long as I'm perfect. That's the lie that they've bought into. So, a reality-based statement based on Scripture is that I am a valuable, fallible child of God. That's really important. Because do you believe God loves you even though you're fallible? Yeah. Well, that's good. But that's not how folks who struggle with an addiction usually feel. They feel God will only love me if I perform. Now, that's not just for addicts. That's for a lot of Christians sitting in the church who are performance-oriented as opposed to grace-oriented. So that's a very important shift, to move from a shame-based, performance-based mentality about myself to being able to really mean it and believe that God loves me even though I'm fallible. He loves me in my fallibility is really critical. And if you knew me very well, you'd know I couldn't have survived this long without thinking God still loved me in spite of my fallibility. Now, the next point is I have no choices and my addiction is all-powerful. And so many times that's that powerlessness we talked about before. And that's the point to begin to say, you know what, your addiction is very strong and it's a monster. It's trying to kill you. But with God's help, you can resist. And that's about reassuring and encouraging them. But it also means I'm not going to let you down either. I'll stand with you and support your healthy choices. But you also need to begin to say to God, I know you can help me. And call out to Him. Because who can be saved by the Lord unless we call out on Him? We have to do that well. So that is important. Also, a person in an addiction, they walk in unforgiveness and resentment towards others, self, and God. And there's a lot to be said about this, and I had a chance to preach a sermon on forgiveness and recovery today, and that was one aspect. There's actually, it's a complex issue of forgiveness, and I think there's probably 5 kinds of forgiveness. I don't have time to go over it. But basically, you have 2 basic categories. You have forgiving others and receiving forgiveness. And then I think about it, when you forgive others, which is what we talked about today in the message, it's about forgiving other people. And then secondly, sometimes we have to forgive God, which is not quite the same thing, but it's a kind of thing we might do. It's not as if God has truly done anything wrong. But it's about, from our finite perspective, we sometimes, in our lack of understanding, genuinely feel resentment and hurt over something that's happened. And so forgiving God is not about overlooking or giving grace to somebody who's done an evil deed, but it is about actually coming to grips with our finite view of it and beginning to say, God, I have to say honestly, I'm angry at you, and I'll forgive you in that sense. I let it go and confess I don't understand it. But many times people have to do that if they have a resentment and their fist is raised towards God. And we already talked about the importance of making things right by forgiving others who have offended us. And then there's the other side about receiving forgiveness, which is also talked a lot about in the 12 steps, for example. Making amends is how it's described there. But that's about going and trying to make things right when we've done something wrong. And that, again, is about asking God to forgive us, and as well as asking others who we may have done some things that have been wounding and hurtful to them as well. And then the last area, those kind of 4 types, the last area I'd suggest is kind of in the middle, because it's both the granting forgiveness and receiving forgiveness, and that is about forgiving yourself. One of the hardest things to do sometimes is to forgive yourself. You might be a very generous person and love to give forgiveness towards others, actually. Maybe you're very merciful. And maybe you have even let yourself be forgiven by God. But sometimes a barrier to receiving God's forgiveness is you won't forgive yourself. And so sometimes as pastors, we have to help people struggle to actually say, I forgive myself for that. It was wrong. I admit I was wrong. But I'll let myself walk in grace and receive grace over that. So there's that kind of other issue in forgiveness sometimes. Bigger issue this, we're talking about individual stuff. Family members many times have hurts and other things that need to be processed around these. But that's an important shift. Walking in grace, processing wounds, and receiving and giving forgiveness. In the addictive mindset, you're dealing often with kind of short-term thinking. That's kind of the classic deal. Because when a person's thinking about using, I can think of a cocaine addict, all he's thinking about is how good it's going to feel when he scores the cocaine. And that's all he can think about. It's just thinking about the few minutes when he's going to first use and what the euphoria will be like and all those kinds of things. Non-addictive thinking helps people direct themselves to the further consequences. And so one of the things you can say to somebody if they're talking about how I'm obsessed with using, well, what happens after you use? And then what happens after that? And then what happens when you don't come home for 2 days and your wife says she doesn't want you to live there anymore? What happened last time? Thinking a little further beyond what the addiction only wants you to do is think about the intensity of a using episode. So encouraging people to begin to say, well, what would happen after that realistically? What happened last time? And helping people begin to project a little bit more in terms of what's the long-term implication of their behavior. Anger towards God and spiritual despair. This has been covered a little bit already. I'll just make this comment. Many people I've worked with will say things like, I felt that I don't want to trust God anymore because I felt like I cried out to Him when I needed help and He wasn't there. That's not uncommon for some folks. Not everybody, but some folks. And what I say to them when they say that, because it sounds like more or less prayer doesn't work, they're dismissing God. I'd say this, look, God is not going to overrule your will. He is not going to do it. And so if you are on your way driving to your dealer and saying, God, please help me stop using, I don't think anything is going to happen. Because you have to stop the car. But I would say typically, if you put your willingness in God's hands, He will do miracles. But He will respect your right to make whatever choice you're making. He won't overrule it. But when you put your willingness on the table, He will do miracles. And that helps clarify that God is not against them, that God didn't let them down, but they actually have to first put their willingness out on the table. So, to me, that's a particularly helpful thing that I found works for some folks to help clarify who's responsible and what do I need to do to reconnect to God sometimes, if that's the kind of problem that's interfering. And again, you can think about how that's compatible in some ways with coming to grips with powerlessness in the language of the 12 steps and so on. But this is about willingness as much as anything else, not just powerlessness. Self-entitlement, self-pity, entitlement, and addiction. This is common in both my marital practice as well as working with addictions. As somebody who's trained in Adlerian psychology originally, there was a strong emphasis on never feeling sorry for anybody. As a therapist, I'm cold, heartless, mean, and ruthless. And one of the things that makes me a good counselor, I hope, is I'm fairly objective at times, or I try to be. But I never, ever, ever feel sorry for clients. I don't feel sorry for people because I think that feeling sorry for people, and this is what Dr. Christensen at the University of Arizona used to tell us as an Adlerian psychologist, he used to say, feeling sorry for people is disrespectful. It's really saying, you're incapable, you're weak, I'll feel sorry for you. I respect people as choice makers made in the image of God. Their choices may be crummy choices, but they are their choices. And I think that's a critical factor because in the area of self-pity, when people feel sorry for themselves, it's a license to kill. If you are in a marriage and you feel sorry for yourself, then you feel like you're justified in doing whatever you can to take care of yourself. And I've had many people sitting in my office who've in the crisis of infidelity, and if you really looked at it, what you found was there was entitlement going on to go and have an affair because they felt sorry for themselves or hurt about something. And that gave them the ammo to say, well, to heck with you, I'll do whatever I have to take care of myself. So feeling sorry for oneself is a license to kill in relationships, and it's a license to use in addictions. So helping a person begin to confront themselves when they're feeling sorry for themselves. In addiction terms, it's about having a pity party for yourself. Well, pity parties will take you right back to the bottle or right back to the drug. Because when you feel sorry for yourself, you get entitled. So those are some internal moves that we talk about. External movement. These are actually more self-explanatory and don't need a lot of extra comment. But you're trying to help the person move from unconscious living to a more conscious lifestyle. And they need to figure out some of the associations that lead them back to the addiction. So it's about changing places and people and things that are connected to the addiction. It's why it's very important if you're dealing with somebody who's using drug paraphernalia, smoking things, they need to get rid of the pipes, not just the drugs. They've got an emotional attachment to that pipe. It's connected to years of euphoria and so on. But it's a piece of darkness they need to throw out. They need to maybe take a look at the places they're spending time in. And if it's connected to drug using or is a slippery place for them, they need to plan on not being there. Or if they have to go to a party or some sort of event where there'll be alcohol, for example, and they're early in recovery, then they need to think through ahead of time, what their policy is going to be and how they're going to make sure they don't drink. But if you don't think ahead, that's a plan to relapse. So you begin to move from unmindfulness to mindfulness. You begin to think about what are the people, places, and things that are slippery and connected and make changes. Secrecy is obviously a hallmark of an addicted life. You think about this, particularly with pornography, it's clear, but it's also true for many other types of addictions. And you want to move people towards openness. You know, Satan loves the darkness, doesn't he? But when you turn on the lights, those cockroaches got to run away. And so beginning to live a life that's open and transparent is part of a value shift from secrecy to health and openness. Deception and honesty, another simple, obvious thing. You work on this maybe with a couple, helping the individual who's been involved and mired in, let's say, chained to pornographic addiction. They need to stop lying about what's going on. They need to start talking about their feelings, and when they're feeling like they want to use pornography, or if they have, and they violated an agreement they had with their mate, they need to talk to their mate about it and be honest about it so that they're no longer hiding in concealment from the truth. Isolation, on one hand, and moving towards connection. And that's fundamental. One of the hallmarks of addictions is you can become increasingly alienated from God and from others and yourself. And so helping reconnect to other people is very important. This is where support groups and self-help groups can be helpful. It's where small groups in the church help you connect. It may mean, I can think of one person I'm working with now, a Christian cocaine addict. He's got a network of 2 or 3 guys. One of them's at work. 2 of them are from his church that he calls when he's feeling cravings. Okay? That's the kind of thing that's excellent to do. Maybe you as his pastor or his counselor or his friend or his sponsor plays that same role. Of course, that's the way the sponsor system works in some of the 12-step programs as well. So that's important to reconnect people. And also that's why marital therapy, I personally don't like to deal with addicts at all anymore individually. I won't take any individual who's a substance abuser without a significant other involved, because I want to help repair that fundamental attachment as an area of, and make it a strength and support. And there's, if at all possible, that's who I choose to work with. Now, I have the luxury of doing that because I'm in private practice and I can pick who I want to work with. You can't do that in community services or other places. But for me, that's ideal type of thing to do if it's possible with a client and if they have a mate. Breaking down isolation and encouraging connection. Avoids taking responsibility for wrongdoing. Instead, move towards taking inventory, taking responsibility, and so on. Does not ask for help is a key thing that is often true for people who are locked into an addiction. They're ashamed. It comes out of the shame base there as well as anything else. But many times they were raised in a family where it was not appropriate to ask for help. We talked about this on one of the other meetings, about how in rural environments sometimes that's very strong. To pull up yourself by the bootstraps, I've got to be stoic and tough it out. It means it's hard to ask when I'm really facing a serious problem. But by building the kind of relationships that you as pastors and pastor spouses often have, you will open the doors for trust so that people may feel more likely to ask for help because they know that you care about them. Addiction is seen as the only reward in life, and developing new rewards is important. That's part of, you're not only leaving behind, but you also need to run towards something. So finding out something else that is encouraging, something else that you love, maybe rediscovering something you used to love. One of the best things, the question is, before the addiction hit, before you got into this, what did you used to like to do? And they might talk about, I used to like to go cross-country skiing, or, I used to go canoeing, or, I would love photography, or I did this or that. And it fell by the wayside as their addiction took over their life. So you can use what they did in the past to recover something for the future. Can't stand negative feelings, has to escape, versus talks about negative feelings and processes them. And then health neglected, that can't stand negative feelings, has to escape is very fundamental. I mean, that's the basic way that most addictions work for people. In some way, they're trying to change their mood. So helping them find a new way to take care of their feelings. First of all, let themselves talk about their feelings. This is the importance of calling and connecting to others. But then secondly, find out some healthy ways. Maybe I feel better when I go exercise. Maybe I feel better when I talk to somebody. Those are ways to get the feelings out so they don't build up and help the addiction. Health neglected and possibly damaged. We talked about this in an earlier session, and trying to build some awareness of nutrition and health recovery. And then having an unstructured, aimless, chaotic lifestyle and turning into a more structured, goal-oriented living. Having a better structure to your life is often helpful to people in addictions. They've been in a lot of chaos. So a good structure is good. Slowing down change is a good idea. Trying to build in some regularity into their life is really important for their recovery. Now we're looking at our next page here. And in the next 17 minutes, we're going to finish this. This page 2, frankly, let me just make a comment about your handout. I purposely designed this so it's self-explanatory. So in the material that I've got here for you tonight, everything is really stated. I'm, in fact, just going to hit highlights on it because it's already clearly stated with plenty of examples. The one place that I want to explain is particularly this page 2. And the next page we'll look at for sure. But we may not get to the last couple of pages, but that's fine. That's why I've given you a pretty full account, so you've got it. Okay? So when we look at this, the stages of change is very important. It used to be the assumption was that people you either wanted to die or get well. You either wanted to go into treatment or you're going to die. And that was pretty much it. But what happened is at the University of Rhode Island, two guys named Prochaska and DiClemente began to evaluate how many times it took to quit smoking. And they were finding out that people needed to attempt to quit smoking successfully, they needed to try to quit something like 4 to 7 times. And that got them thinking that instead of thinking about relapse as a disaster or a failure, relapse actually builds toward recovery if a person's trying. Because beating an addiction means repeatedly failing before you succeed, probably. And some of you who are in recovery can say, yeah, that's probably true. I tried a couple of times. I knew a guy that I worked at the VA hospital with down in Arizona. He had been in treatment probably 15 times. Now, she was a pretty severe street alcoholic. When I met him, he had a master's degree and was running the rehabilitation program. And he was a hopeless case in Wisconsin, where he was from. But God had turned his life around. But he had turned his life around because he finally got it. So they began to say to themselves, maybe there's a process of change that we need to pay attention to. It's not either you're going to change now or never, but we need to think about change process. So they came up with what's called the Wheel of Change. Many of you may know this already. How many of you have never seen this before? Okay, significant number. We're going to run through these stages. The pre-contemplation stage the characteristic of that is the person has no awareness of the problem. They're clueless. We would say maybe they're in denial, but I don't use the term denial too much. For whatever reason is, they don't have much self-awareness of the problem. They minimize it. They don't think it's a big deal. This is the person that comes to you in community services or comes to your pastor's office and says, my wife says I'm an alcoholic. What do you think, Pastor? Or That person is in the pre-contemplation stage. They're not even contemplating change. They're not contemplating change. The pastoral counseling task for that stage is that person needs awareness of their problem. So the problem in the old days with the old paradigm was that person would come in, the wife said, my wife says I'm an alcoholic. Am I an alcoholic? Well, and then you'd get into an argument with them. If you said, yeah, you sound like an alcoholic to me, they say, well, you're crazy, you're just like my wife. And the more you confronted them, the more resistance they got, and then they went out the door and you said, well, the person just isn't ready, come back when you're ready to live. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. A better approach would be to say, a person doesn't have awareness, then my job is to maybe help them become aware a little bit. So my response with that kind of conversation is say, I don't know if you're an alcoholic. I left my alcoholic-ometer home. I can't tell. And then just ask open-ended questions that might raise awareness without taking a position and pointing the finger. Because that will create confrontation and tend to drive them off. So in pre-contemplation, what you want to do is just ask open-ended questions, maybe do a little minimal assessment type thing, and then just leave it up to them, saying, I don't know. What do you think? Why does your wife say that? Get them talking about what the wife is saying, because then they have to hear themselves say it. Has anybody else ever expressed any concerns? Have you ever been worried about it? Did you ever have a problem with the law because you were drinking? How's your finances? How often are you going out? Getting them talking about what's going on makes them have to hear it. But avoid confronting at this point because it's not going to help you. Raise awareness. Maybe you should go to, go to community services. If I were their pastor, I might say, go to community services and just talk to them. Maybe you're not. Maybe your wife's crazy, but it would be helpful to find out a little more. Because if you can get them starting to think about it, maybe then they'll move ahead in the stages of change. The second area is contemplation. And that person is thinking about change. They're coming to you and they're saying, pastor, counselor, I think I've got a problem. I know something's not right. I guess I know I'm using drugs too much and I'm worried about it. But I'm not sure, whether I want to do anything. That person is marked by ambivalence. And that's a big word to put in there, ambivalence. That's the characteristic of a person who's a contemplator of change. They're torn. Part of them wants to get away from the addiction. Part of them really loves the addiction. They're not sure they're ready yet. Now, again, the old paradigm was to try to get them immediately maybe into groups or immediately into an inpatient treatment facility. Because what they described is maybe obviously they got a problem, but they weren't owning it. I would recommend to you that another way to go, what would happen then, you're trying to push them into action when they are still just thinking about possibly changing. So don't push them into action too soon. Explore the ambivalence, and one of the best ways to do that is by doing what's described later in this outline for you to take home, is about doing double-sided reflections. So on one side, you feel like your drinking is really starting to affect your marriage and your wife's really mad at you and you feel like you should do something. On the other hand, you really enjoy drinking with guys after work and you feel like you're going to look like a jerk if you don't drink anymore. That's a double-sided reflection. It's capturing the ambivalence. And then you can always underline the negative as you go along a little bit. But what you're doing when you do the ambivalence piece is you're respecting the fact of how it's working for them. All right? And they may not have ever been respected for how it works for them. Because they're used to immediate arguments that they better stop drinking because they're a dirty dog. And instead, what you're doing is respecting their tornness. And again, if you think about attachment theory and romance of addiction, breaking up is hard to do. And if somebody comes in and says, oh, my boyfriend is the worst jerk and he nearly kicked me out of the car. We were driving 40 miles an hour. Well, what's my response? Well, you better get away from this guy. He's terrible. He's bad news. Are you kidding me? That's my boyfriend. How dare you say that about him? What do they do as soon as you start to argue? They take the opposite position, correct? So you might be better off doing the ambivalence. Well, I know you really like this guy a lot, but I'm also hearing you're really worried about this treatment. I mean, that's dangerous, but I know you really are attached to him. you do that, what happens is they're going to start bringing up more of the dark side that they're afraid to talk about because they don't want to just be told what to do. Preparation stage is simple. In the preparation stage, a person may be willing to start making some changes, and they're at least moving into some small changes. And their client need in there is to actually get more guidance rather than just do double-sided reflections and tease out the ambivalence. And so what you want to do is maybe talk to them about possibilities, what they could do. Well, when you're ready, you might try one of the AA meetings in town. Or when you're ready, you should check in with community services. They have all these help for people who are struggling with addictions, and you're paying for it, so at least you should check it out. So that might be a possibility for you. So you're helping them understand that. In the action stage itself, you probably could give them a menu of opportunities. And in that stage, the person's really ready to go. They're saying, look, I got to do something about this. What do I need to do? And then you might respond by, depending on the severity of their problem or whatever, you might say, well, listen, a good plan might be to start checking out a couple of support meetings here in town. And another thing you should do is definitely go to community mental health. I've got a friend named Bob in church here I know he's come through recovery, and he would really like to mentor somebody who's struggling in this area. And he'd be happy to start meeting with you weekly and do some discipleship with you and really talk about what's going on. And I would like you to talk to your small group at church and let the other couples in your couples group know what's going on so they can pray and support you and help you too. So you come up with kind of a multidimensional approach that looks in. Maybe they need to see a physician depending on what's going on. So there might be a number of things you could do. But it's good to have thought out a menu of options and know the phone numbers of community services and have a list of the 12-step programs in your office that you can get to give them and so on. So they've got the material when they're ready to act. Then they move into the maintenance stage, which is where you're supporting and working on the internal and external changes that we just covered. Okay, and so we're talking here about getting people into treatment. Before we were talking about the whole process of kind of converting from the addicted mind into the recovering mind. Okay. And then and so we've covered maintenance a little bit, and that's a bigger topic, and there's lots of help and so on. But let's jump down to relapse, because we have talked about some maintenance issues and themes. And relapse, the characteristic there, of course, is having gone back to the use. And what I would suggest to you, and this is also in your notes later here, that you want to distinguish a little bit between slips and relapses. It used to be for some times any kind of use was judged a relapse and so on. But I would suggest to you that if a person's a slip is something where you make a small mistake, it's a relatively short duration, it doesn't have huge consequences usually, and the person makes a conscious decision to come forward and come back and say, I know I'm getting off track here. And so they stop themselves fairly quickly. A relapse, it's kind of a fuzzy line, it's much more extensive. And that's where they're really going back into the behavior, usually for numerous days or a week or more or something like that. It's an important distinction sometimes because people tend to beat themselves up a little less for a slip. And so if you can frame it as a slip, that sometimes makes them feel like they haven't totally lost their recovery. But the other thing that I think is very important, and this goes back to the principles of motivational interviewing that are later covered in this document you take home, is that we need to see relapse not as a total moral failure or that the recovery's in the toilet, but as relapse is part of recovery. The couple I'm working with now, he's a cocaine addict. He relapsed after 11 months of sobriety. Now, his wife took some very firm boundaries and stands with him and asked him to leave the house for 60 days. But one of the things I said to her when I was talking to her about whether she wanted to remain married to him, because he's had a number of problems over the years, is we really talked about this idea of relapse is part of recovery. And I think it's right in their case. He's really done a lot of good work. Let's not throw it all out because he went on a binge. There needs to be consequences that remind him that if he doesn't make some changes, this is not going to go on forever. But at the same time, let's not catastrophize relapse either. It can be viewed as a learning experience. And so one of the things I did with him, I brought a letter with me. I don't have it. I'm not going to read it right now. But I asked him, what did you learn from this? And one of the things I did with him in counseling, I said, what was going on with you before your relapse happened? So we could understand what set you up for going back to where you were. And he began to talk about it. He said, well, John, what happened was about in October, I was I was feeling stressed at job. There were some job changes there. I was feeling insecure. I was coming up for my evaluation, and I was really stressed at work. And then on top of that, at night, my wife would go to bed very early. I was staying up late. I was getting on the computer and going back into my porn, because he had been a pornography addict for a number of years too. And so the secrecy piece that was related to his pornography use really liked to kick up his addiction to cocaine, because that's part of that secret world of sneaking off and using. And so the secrecy related to the one addiction fed the secrecy of the other addiction. And so all these things were going on. And what we identified was the place, and he said, I stopped talking to the people I'm supposed to talk to. I stopped talking about how I was feeling. I began to withdraw. So, it didn't just come and get him in November when he relapsed on cocaine. He started to decide to use back in early October when he started getting involved in these other activities. The isolation, the deception, the pornography, all that stuff. And so if he's going to plan for relapse prevention, he's got to pay attention to that stuff. He said, next time you do anything with pornography, you need to immediately talk to your wife. Because if you don't, the world of secrecy and the sexiness of your addiction is going to come and get you. And if you're not communicating with other people, you're going to have to realize that that's a sign that you're preparing to relapse. It's conscious. Don't kid yourself. You're making the phrase that Alan Marlett uses is seemingly irrelevant decisions that actually are pre-relapse behaviors. So try to take a relapse by looking at what was going on that led you there in order to get a better picture of how to plan for making that your last relapse if possible. Because relapse is really part of recovery. And let's hope you don't have to do 6 more. Let's hope this will be the one that really takes. But if it isn't, stop it as soon as you can, and let's learn from it, and let's go on. That's a different frame on it. Well, I have had a great time here with everybody. We know that the material in the remaining pages on eliciting self-motivating statements, I've given you examples for each one of these. These are the kind of things that when people say these in your office, a person comes in and says, man, I'm here because if I don't get my act together, my boss is going to axe me. It sounds corny, but just simply reflecting that and saying, okay, well, you're really worried about what your boss is going to say, and you don't know what you're going to do if you lose your job. What you're doing with that is not just being a simplistic Rogerian reflector, but what you're doing is actually reminding the person of what he said of his concern. You're actually deepening his concern by reflecting that back. And so on and so forth. And the concern of others and intention to change, you're reinforcing it. So in the case of the example there, if somebody's saying, when I look at my son in the cradle, etc., and you feed that back and you say, it sounds like you really care about your kids and it's really important for you to recover for them. So you're not giving them a sermon. You're sticking with what you're hearing them say that's important. And that fits along well with work in ambivalence and picking up motivational bases that they have. So I hope that this material is helpful to you. You do have, in addition, a handout that's an extensive handout, a bibliography that I gave out. And so I'm just going to remind you of that. There's a number of books. I'll just hit the highlights on the pages here. And then Lee, why don't you come on up here right now? It's just so... because he's not pushing me at all in any way. I want to be respectful of the parameters here. The first section of the bibliography is on general books that are Christian books, and I've given you some of my comments. Some of you may like some of these books, may not. They're just some of the ones I like and have gained from, and so on. The online recovery resources for pastors and therapists, there's a whole bunch of things. There's a good world out there of Christian recovery in particular. And so I just encourage you, when you're on the net or the web, check out a few of these and see the kind of organizations and materials and resources that are there. Because you might discover some resources that you're unaware of that you might want to use at your church or in your ministry or even in preparing a sermon. Then the next page is recommended substance abuse counseling texts for mental health professionals. I know that I had a conversation with several of you today in the community. If you're involved in mental health in the community, these are books that I think are particularly good, and I've tried to highlight the ones that I think I use a lot. And then the last section is on pornography and sexual addiction resources. I've mentioned that one of the great things to do is to find a server like Covenant Eyes, and there's other ones that allow you to not just filter out stuff, but have accountability partners who view what you view on your computer to build kind of an internal responsibility, not to enter into that world of fantasy and isolation that so undermines our spirituality and our relationship with our mate. Again, I want to thank you for having me here, and I would like to thank particularly Dr. McDonald and the board of Acadia for extending the kind invitation and the honor of being the Simpson Lecturer this year. Thank you very much. Bless you, Lee.